Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the Center for inviting me. And Jerry and your team, great job in organizing it. I'm going to be drawing on work with co-authors that I've been doing over the last couple of years. Most notably here is Ted Truman. We wrote a paper about 2 years ago in October. It'll be 2 years on reforming the global financial architecture, focusing on the IMF and the FSB, the Financial Stability Board. But I'm also going to be drawing in the periphery on some work with Maria Nieto, a paper with Vitor Gaspar, applying Menker-Olson's economics of collective goods to the problem of multilateral collective action. Let me show you the roadmap while I'm telling you what the 4 takeaways are, in my view. First, the global financial architecture is a very complex construct of national, regional, international, official, private mechanisms and markets. It's not just about the international financial institutions. It's about member countries' contributions to public goods as well, through the IMF and in other ways. Related to that, the second takeaway is that while you can quibble with how the IMF and how the World Bank and even how the Financial Stability Board operates and what their failures and successes are, ultimately it's the member countries of these organizations that are accountable for their successes and their failures. And to overcome the failures and increase the successes, member countries must reform their financial architectures and their financial systems. Third, and now I'm getting more at 10,000 or maybe 30,000 feet, you could view the pre-crisis global architecture as one that was stuck in a Cournot or Nash equilibrium, meaning countries were supplying the public good we call financial stability only up to the point that it served their national interest. In that kind of a world where you have many countries optimizing according to that criteria, they all reach an equilibrium they think is best for themselves and everyone else, and it turns out to be suboptimal for the global community. So post-crisis, I view these reform efforts as trying to move us beyond the Nash equilibrium to closer to a Pareto optimal equilibrium. You can also see this as a Coasian challenge, and trying to let the private sector work out whatever deals they can to promote financial stability. Finally, the final takeaway is that the European problems that Europeans are trying to solve with architectural reform, it represents a microcosm of many of the challenges that the global community is facing now and will face in the future to solidify the global financial architecture's role in promoting financial stability. So those are the 4 takeaways. Okay, I'm going to put up these slides. I'm not really going to read them for you. I think you can read. But the point here is that the global financial architecture is a very complex composite. It's an architecture, it's a framework that tries to facilitate private finance. It also facilitates government finance. It's composed of private infrastructures like exchanges. It's comprised of official mechanisms like payment systems and so on. So it's really complex. The IMF, the World Bank, and other IFIs are certainly a part of it. But my view is there's too much focus on reforming those institutions, though that's important, and not enough in reforming the member countries, particularly the large international financial centers, which after all were the centers of these crises that we're trying to deal with. That's my accountability point. Now this is a very complex matrix, but to me it represents one way of looking at the financial architecture. Along the rows, these rows are what I call the lines of defense, which are very much a part of the global financial architecture. They're lines of defense against systemic risk. If we can prevent systemic risk from occurring or from getting too large, then the global financial architecture through these vehicles, market discipline, financial regulation, micro and macro prudential supervision, and crisis management and resolution, if these are all working well, then the global financial architecture is delivering the public good of financial stability. When they're not working well, we get financial instability and perhaps global crises like we did in 2008, 2009. Across the top are the sources of cross-border systemic risk, and of course they are global financial institutions, markets, unregulated financial activities, and even policy mistakes. I don't really have time to go through all this. Suffice it to say that if you go to each cell, you can identify failures that occurred that contributed to the global crisis of 2007 through now. The G20 worked very hard during the crisis to identify areas of reform, and my colleagues dealt with all of them, really. So I see little need to go through them again, but here they are. I agree with much, if not all, of what my colleagues said about each individual item of reform. We are behind in most of them, more so in dealing, in my view, with the SIFIs and the too big to fail problem. In that area, my preference would be to consider, and this is not what Dodd-Frank did, would be to consider more fundamental reform, rethinking how financial services should be delivered in this modern global economy that we live in and modern global financial system. Many of the institutions that we call too big to fail are too big to fail, they're too big to manage, and they're really not delivering financial services optimally over time. In small periods of time, they might be delivering services optimally, but then you get a severe crisis, and we need to understand that calculus. So over time, intertemporally, can these too big to fail institutions provide financial services efficiently? I think if we were good at measuring this, we would find probably not. So there is good reason to consider creating a financial private architecture that specializes more than it does now. So break them up. Okay, I think Jim really summarized pretty well where we are today. Too little, too late, and things are not moving quickly enough. I myself think Basel III now is really at risk. It's in limbo. It should have been in limbo from the start. But even now, people at the Bank of England and in this country as well are thinking we need something different than Basel III. It's way too complex. You just can't measure the risks that you're setting aside capital for, and you're leaving too much of it up to the individual institutions themselves. The European crisis is a fascinating experiment in institution building. People were talking, even before the introduction of the euro back in 1997, 98, much of the work at the IMF, by the way, about how their architectural design implicit in the Maastricht Treaty was just not up to the task of crisis management. On the sidelines of conferences over the decade and a half following that, many European policymakers themselves would admit that they don't know how they would manage a crisis. Thank goodness they haven't had one. Well, here we are today, and watching them debate how to go forward in building an architecture, in my mind, truly is a microcosm of what we are facing in the global community. Okay, so what context do we need? What context can we use for thinking about reform? And I mentioned earlier the work of Menker Olson, The Economics of Collective Action. He looked at the delivery of, thank you, he looked at the delivery of a public good called national defense. NATO was having trouble, mostly because the U.S. felt it was contributing the vast majority of resources. And so Menker Olson got to work to try to figure out why that was the case. And so he set up a framework in which you have end countries optimizing the delivery of a public good subject to certain constraints, but also he imposed on that they are optimizing a national welfare function, not a global welfare function. What kind of an equilibrium would they come to? Well, they would come to a Cournot-Nash equilibrium in which each country was optimizing, but the collective was sub-optimizing. You can clearly show within that framework that there were Pareto optimal solutions that were either near or far from this Nash equilibrium. And so then the challenge was how to get countries to better coordinate, better cooperate, and bargain with each other to move everyone to a better equilibrium. I think that's where we are now. We're stuck in a catch-22 in which we need incentives for national leaders to cooperate and change their domestic policies and increase the amount of the public good they provide. And yet, these national leaders are subject to national elections in which most people don't really care about the collective good outside of their country. So this is a dilemma, and I don't really have a solution for it. In an ideal world, there would be some umbrella organization that would provide incentives for national leaders to move from their individual Nash equilibrium to a better collective equilibrium. Countries created the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and other global networks and organizations, but these are governed by the very countries that created them to govern themselves. So it's a self-governing system, and I think the global crisis of 2007 proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that we need something better than that. So there are two paths to reform. One is basically to take the status quo institutions and make them better. And in this case, if we're going to continue down that path rather than some more major path, there are three areas at least. One, we need to restore or provide the IFIs with greater political independence and more bite. When they say U.S. fiscal policy is out of whack and is creating global imbalances, whether you believe that or not, when the IMF declares something in its surveillance, it should have more bite so that the country cannot just ignore it and walk away from it. I don't know what that bite should be. I don't have any ideas about how to move forward on that. But that needs to be part of the solution. The second area is that we need to increase the IFI's collective decision-making within House. And to me, that means realigning the balance of voting. Professor Wade discussed that in detail yesterday. And we need to rationalize the existing institutional framework. And a trivial example is you have the G20, you have the FSB, you have these standard-setting bodies, and they're all operating separately with different secretariats, and all the while the IMF is supposed to be doing global surveillance over all of these. Why not just think about how to rationalize all of those organizations and, at minimum, subsume their secretariat, keep the secretariats as separate ongoing operations, but subsume them under the IMF umbrella, or create a new institution that can subsume them all. So I see that as marginal reforms because it's taking more or less the institutional structure as is and reforming that. More major reforms, and here's where the European debate comes in, more major reforms would try to transition to a new global architecture that should have at least these three elements. There need to be legal and enforceable international surveillance mechanisms that have the bite to promote altering macroeconomic and macroprudential policies before crises occur. Of course, even if that ability is improved, there will be crises. So then what does the international community need? It needs legal and enforceable crisis management and resolution mechanisms, and it needs to go beyond what the IMF is today. We need an international law that lays all of this out. We don't yet have that. Finally, we need a global financing mechanism that goes beyond the IMF's balance sheet. The IMF's balance sheet, depending on which global financial institution you take, like a Deutsche Bank or a Citigroup, the IMF balance sheet is anywhere between 1/2 and 1/5 of the balance sheet of a global institution. There are many impediments to reform, not the least of which is, in my opinion, there is a lack of leadership at the national level to push these global reforms through. Thank you very much.